Hello everyone, my name is Sidhu. I work with Remax Real Estate Mountain View. As you know, we have done some videos in the past about giving you some knowledge, and today we want to address the issue, the legal issues that come up when you're buying or selling properties. I hope this video really helps you. And today I have with me Brent Epp, a lawyer with My Professional. Hi Brent, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Harry. Thanks for having me here today.
Yes, Brent, thanks for coming in actually. So I would like to again ask you a few questions if you don't mind. Because some of the buyers or sellers usually do ask us all these questions, and so it can actually help them when they are actually thinking of buying or selling real estate and all that.
Right, right. Yeah, I have to say that, thousands of Calgarians every year buy and sell a house. So every house deal has a lawyer involved, either for the seller or for the buyer. And there's always a few basic issues that need to be covered off. And so what we want to do today is just discuss a little bit about some of the common issues that a seller might have, some of the common issues that a buyer might have.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So what is an RPR, and why is it so important?
Right. So in Alberta, we use a standard real estate contract. As a realtor, you would have access to this standard document that facilitates most transactions. Most buyers and sellers use a very similar document to enter into the agreement. One of the provisions in that agreement says that the seller is going to deliver or provide an RPR, a real property report. That real property report looks something like this. In fact, they all look very much like this. And basically what it is a surveyor's outline of the state of the property. It shows the boundaries of the property, and it shows where the house is located, where the fences are located, those sorts of permanent items on the property. And so the RPR is really important because it allows the purchaser to know that the house that they're buying meets all the standards of the City of Calgary bylaws and those types of requirements. It's also important for the buyer with respect to their financing, because the bank that they're borrowing money from will want to make sure that their property complies with all the bylaws. Oh, yeah. And so the reason an RPR is so important is, first of all, because it's something you're required to give under the contract, but also because it does give an exact representation of what you're buying from a surveying perspective. And it's one of the first things that a seller has to really look at when they're intending to buy or to sell their house. The issue is that on the day that you sell your house, when you close that deal, you have to have what's called a current RPR. So every time somebody buys a house, they will get an RPR. If you buy a brand new house, your builder will give you an RPR. Right. If you buy a house from just the person who's lived in it previously, they will also have to give you that RPR. And the issue is, if between the time you bought it and now you're going to sell it, say you've made the deck larger, or you've replaced your roof and you changed maybe the dimensions of the overhangs of your eaves or something like that, you will have to have your RPR updated. And so that can take a number of weeks, and there's a cost involved from the surveying company to do that. And I guess the point of all of this discussion with the RPR is simply that we don't want to be scrambling at the last minute trying to get an RPR to deliver to the buyer. Because if we can't close on time because we don't have an RPR, or if we can't deliver that, we still want to close on time, but we might have to negotiate what's called a holdback, where as the purchaser will say, we want you to hold back some money so that we can make sure that when you do get that to us, that it is current and accurate.
Obviously, they have to make sure that part, there's no doubt. I mean, then if they don't look after it that time, probably they'll have issues in the future, I guess, right?
That's right. And so, for example, if you have an RPR where there is, say the fence that was built goes across a city right-of-way, a utility right-of-way where there's sewer lines or something's underneath the property, we might have to get an encroachment agreement, and so you might have to deal with the city. And so all these things can take time. And the challenge really is that it can create a bit of a cash flow situation for the seller. And the reason is this, because if the seller doesn't, usually sellers are becoming buyers. Most often somebody's selling a house because they're buying something else. And so if they are not going to get the full amount of the sale proceeds, that might affect their ability to close the deal on the purchase side.
Oh yeah.
And so by making sure that your RPR is up to date and current before they come and even talk to somebody like you, another realtor agent, or another agent, it's really important that they just have this on their radar, and at least it's in process as part of the selling.
Oh, perfect. Really good information on that. Related to RPR, you just mentioned about holdbacks. So let's talk about some holdbacks that there are.
Right. Right. So there's some common holdbacks, and a holdback is simply when the money that is used to close a transaction is held by either the buying lawyer or the seller's lawyer, sort of pending the resolution of the issue. So for example, in the RPR, we talked about, say an encroachment agreement is needed with the city for permission to have the fence remain on the city's right-of-way. So sometimes that might create a $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 holdback, where until we get that permission from the city, we're not going to release that money to the seller. And so that can create an issue. Sometimes on the certificate of title to the home, there will be a lien that's been registered. Maybe there's been some landscaping work, and while that process is going on, there's been a lien put on there because there's been a disagreement about payment that was or wasn't made to the landscaper. And so those types of things can all create holdbacks, because one of the obligations of the seller, of course, is to ultimately deliver clean title to the buyer. The mortgage has to be taken off. The existing mortgage has to be taken off. These liens have to be taken off. Sometimes there might be a marital breakdown or in the process, and one of the spouses will put something on title to the house, pending the resolution of the marriage breakdown or the divorce. And so all of those things, of course, can make closing a little bit tricky. And related to that, the buyer is always going to make sure that there's money held back until the seller can deal with those issues that's on their title. And so those are usually what holdbacks are about. There's usually something that's registered on title or a problem with the RPR, where there's a sum of money that's held back until that issue is dealt with.
Oh, I see. Okay. So where you're trying to protect the buyers as well, just to make sure that things get looked after and title is clean at the end of it.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. The great thing about using the agreements that we use in Alberta is that they're really for the protection of the buyer and the seller. At the end of the day, we all want to have a clean deal where there's no problems, full monies are released, and most of the time that's how it happens. But as a seller, we just have to be aware that if you're intending to put your property on the market and there are some of these things registered against your title, it could complicate things. So it's better to deal with that up front before you even before you put your house on the market, perhaps. But those are good discussions to have with the realtor, who will often pull title early on in the process to see what's on title.
So dower can be an issue. What is dower?
Yeah. So the Dower Act in Alberta is legislation that came in the 1930s as a way to protect farmers from the banks. And the basic principle behind dower is that when a married couple live in a house, both parties have to consent to selling that house or putting debt on the house, a mortgage or something like that. And so one of the issues that we always need to deal with is are we getting the consent of both parties? Now, obviously, oftentimes there's only one person living in the house and only one person on title, and then dower isn't an issue, although we still have to make some statements about it in the contract and in the closing documents. But the issue with dower is that if, say for example, you and your wife have been living in a house for 15 years, but you are the only person on title. When you go to sell your house, your wife is going to have to give her consent to you selling the matrimonial or the family home. And it's really for the protection of the family unit. And so dower consent or the dower rights are something that we have to deal with in every real estate transaction.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the other, an issue related to dower is that if a marriage is in the process of say there's difficulties and the couple is splitting up, because of the Dower Act, it's possible in the situation of a marriage breakdown for one of the spouses to register an instrument on title that can prevent the other person from selling the title or from selling the house. And sometimes if the spouse is concerned that the person who's selling the house is going to use the money unwisely or send it out of the country or something like that, they will put an instrument on title that will create some problems on the closing. And so again, there might be holdback issues, as we discussed previously, where if there is a writ or a legal instrument registered on title about litigation, then we need to make sure that we deal with that as part of the preparation for closing. And we don't want there to be surprises at closing.
At the very end, yes.
That's right.
Yeah, that's
the best deals are the deals where there's no surprises, no last minute things to deal with. So, so the Dower Act, we always have to be careful when it's time to sell your house. If your marriage is in the process of, if you're having some hard times in your marriage, that may not be the time to try to sell your house unless you and your spouse are on the same page, and maybe you want to both sell the property and split up the assets. That's a different situation. But generally speaking, it won't be possible for one person to sell the property without the other person being aware of it.
So it protects the rights of the other person.
That's right.
At the
That's
same
right.
time.
So it protects the husband and the wife or the partners in the marriage.
Oh, perfect. Are there any tax issues when selling the house?
Yeah. So in Canada, we're really fortunate to have what's called a principal residence exemption. The home that we live in as our primary residence, generally speaking, the increase in value of that property during the time that we own it is going to be exempt from any capital gains taxes when we go to sell it. Now, we've had this rule, this tax ruling for years, and so every Canadian who owns a house is always looking forward to that day when they can sell it and enjoy an increase in the value of their property without having to pay tax on it. Recently, CRA changed some of the rules on how that is reported, and so while there is still no tax payable on the capital gain if you're a principal residence, it is now a requirement that when you file your personal taxes that you report the sale of that property. And so that's a recent change to the tax filing requirements. And so sellers need to be aware that when they do sell their property, even though there's no tax payable on it, we have to tell CRA that we sold the property and what price we sold it for and that sort of thing.
I think they just started about 2 or 3 years ago, right?
That's 2006. I want to say 2016. It's either 2016 or 2017. I'm not. Must be 16.
16, yeah.
16.
A couple of years ago that they started.
Yeah. So in 2016, CRA made that a requirement.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. And the second tax issue is that as a seller, if you're not a Canadian resident for tax purposes, you have some other obligations when you sell your property, because that capital gains exemption that is available to Canadian tax residents isn't available to you.
Oh yeah.
And so that will create perhaps some problems. So if you're not a tax resident of Canada, even though you own a house here, it's possible. You might think you're selling your house for $400,000, but because of the withholding taxes and the taxes that need to be ultimately paid to CRA, you will not likely have anywhere near that $400,000 to turn around and buy your next house until CRA sorts things out with the tax situation there.
Oh, I see. Yes, sometimes actually, you know what, people make mistake thinking if they're non-resident, they can just sell it and move on. But
that's right. The lawyers between them will figure out exactly how much the purchase price, what we need to hold back either in the tax account or remit to CRA as a withholding tax.
Okay, perfect. So what happens when somebody wants to close a sale before their own house sells?
Right.
Is there any issue with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, in a perfect world, we would close the sale of our house on the same day that we close the purchase of our house, but life isn't perfect. And so sometimes what happens is that house that we really want, the sellers of that house really want the deal to close on say the 15th of the month, but maybe the house that we're selling, we're not going to close that deal maybe till the 25th of the month.
Okay.
So there's going to be a 10-day period where you're the happy owner of two houses. And the difficulty that creates for many people is that in order to close the purchase of the house, you might have to get what's called interim financing or bridge financing. And banks are familiar with this. This happens very commonly. But it is one thing as a seller just to be aware that if you're selling your house and that deal is closing after the purchase of your next house, you might have to do some arrangements with your bank, and you'll have to deal with your lawyers and to try to sort out so that we've got enough money to close the purchase of your new house. And so interim financing, very common, but it's not an insurmountable problem. Sometimes people don't know how they're going to be able to close that purchase, but usually it's as simple as going to the bank and arranging with your banker this bridge financing, and the lawyers will sort of take care of how the money flows in that situation. But it's something that shouldn't ever slow down a deal, but it's something to be aware of, that if you are buying a house before your house is selling, you will have to get this other financing in addition to the mortgage that you're probably going to have to get on your new house.
That's right. Banks are aware, actually. You know what? It happens quite often as
Absolutely.
well. Where they just make those two deals happen, actually, even when the closings are on different dates.
That's right.
Now, let's talk about high ratio mortgages. What kind of issues they can bring up?
Right. So it's interesting when we're talking about legal issues that a seller might face that we'd be talking about a high ratio mortgage. What's that all about? Sometimes people, they don't remember that maybe when they bought their house, they had to borrow a large amount of money relative to the value of the house they were buying. And so sometimes if it's more than 80%, we call that a high ratio mortgage. And there's special rules around high ratio mortgage. And the secret for sellers to remember is that in a time of rising interest rates, there's going to be purchasers out there who may want to assume your existing mortgage. The rule of thumb with a high ratio mortgage is you don't want to let a buyer assume your high ratio mortgage. And the reason for that is really straightforward. Under a high ratio mortgage, the lender and Canada Housing Corporation, they can come back on the person who assumed the mortgage for any shortfall, but they can also come back on the seller who let the purchaser assume that mortgage. So the general rule of thumb is if you had a high ratio mortgage on the house that you're selling, you don't want to let a purchaser assume that mortgage.
Oh, okay. Because then at the same time, banks are trying to protect themselves as well in case something goes wrong, I guess.
That's right. I mean, it's one of these situations where because they have lent so much money relative to the value of the house, it's possible that they're, in the event of a foreclosure, if the person you sold the house to defaults on their mortgage, it's possible that there isn't enough equity there to cover all of the expenses and the bank's loan and all these things. And the issue there is that there's personal liability associated with high ratio mortgages.
Okay. So now let's move towards the issues the buyers face. What are the common things that buyers are concerned about, actually?
Right. Well, as we mentioned in the context of sellers, just like sellers are buyers, buyers are usually sellers. And again, one of the common issues that we run into is the whole issue of making sure that there's adequate cash to do what you need to do, both on selling your house and on buying your house. And so, again, one of the things that a buyer has to be aware of is if their deal is closing before they might be selling their existing house, again, they might have to look into that whole issue of bridge financing, getting just making sure there's adequate cash to close their purchase. And again, working with the realtor, working with the lawyer, working with your banker, we'll be able to sort through those issues. It's really common for a purchase to occur before you sell your house, and there's ways to make sure that financing can be in place for that purchase, but we just always want to have enough lead time to deal with those issues. And because bridge financing just introduces another level of complexity and an extra step into the process. Certainly not an insurmountable step by any means, but it's just something that we need to be aware of early on in the process of buying a house.
That's really good to know, yeah. So what are the common issues for financing when it comes to buying properties? Yeah.
Right. For most of us, when we buy a house, there's going to be some level of bank financing involved. And in those cases, what buyers really need to be aware of is that sometimes banks will have certain conditions that they'll put on the financing. And so recently in Canada, we've had this introduction of a stress test.
That's right, yes.
Some of those issues that you're familiar with from your side of things. And so we just want to simply make sure that when we go into the market to buy a house, that we actually know what we can afford. And we also want to know, in addition to making sure that the stress test requirements are met, sometimes people, when they go to buy a house, a bank will put on additional conditions with respect to other debt that they might have.
Oh, okay.
So it's really important that the buyer that's going out to the marketplace, that's talking to their realtor, is realistic about how much money they have to actually like what their price thresholds are. As a buyer, I just want to make sure that at the end of the day, when I buy my house, I haven't been stretched so thin that I can't afford to enjoy my house by buying maybe some furniture that I might need. By being, I've still got to pay property taxes and utilities, all those things. And so we don't want to stretch ourselves too thin. And the best way to protect ourselves against that is by being very clear with our banks what our wishes are, and making sure that the bank has reviewed their own records sufficiently so that they know exactly how much they can lend us, and that there's not last minute surprises on financing not coming through exactly the way we had anticipated that it would.
So you're trying to say is that even if you're approved for 500,000, see if you can go with something a little lower, so you're not stretching, so there are no surprises at the end. And yeah,
that's right, because everybody's financial situation is different. I mean, we know that there's a certain percentage of Canadians who, we can get approved for a high level of financing, but we have to be able to service that month after month after month. So in Calgary, we're very fortunate to be coming out of the most recent recession. Job numbers seem to be getting better. The economy seems to be getting better. And so the tendency is for people to be approved for a certain level of financing from their bank. And but we just want to make sure always that we're living responsibly and within our means, and that we're not putting undue stress and pressure on our families. And but we need to work with our banks. Just to be clear, that even though we might be approved for a certain amount, when the deal, when it comes to closing, we want to know exactly how much the bank is going to provide for us so that we know how much we have to contribute from our own resources.
Even though we are talking about buyers, what if the seller is non-resident? You already mentioned
Right.
that about the
Right.
taxes, but what else kind of brings?
When I'm acting for a buyer, one of the things that all lawyers will get on a deal is a statement from the seller that they are a resident of Canada for tax purposes.
Mhm.
And the reason that's important for the buyer is that even though the seller is responsible for those taxes if they're not a resident of Canada, if the seller has left the country or was never in the country to begin with, and CRA can't collect on that withholding tax that the seller should have paid to CRA, CRA can actually come back on the purchaser of that house. So it's actually the purchaser's liability as well. And so it sounds unusual for a buyer to think, I have to be concerned about the tax status of the person I'm buying the house from.
That's right.
But in fact, it is the case that one of the things we want to cover off from the legal side is just making sure that we're not exposing the buyer to a liability from CRA because the seller has not remitted their taxes when they sold the house.
Yeah, just when you're thinking to buy property, you usually don't think that far that, should we know if the seller is non-resident or not.
That's right. We do the house inspection. We want to make sure that the mortgage registered on title by the previous owner is taken off, all those things. But one of the jobs of the lawyer is just to make sure that we're protecting the buyer from any hidden tax liability that might be there.
Okay, that's good. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah. So in Alberta, we're very fortunate that we have a really robust land title system. In Alberta, when you pull a certificate of title on a house, you can rely on what's on that document as to know what the legal obligations are for the buyer to deal with and for the seller to deal with. And so part of the job of the lawyer is to make sure that in reviewing the title that we are doing our jobs with respect to protecting the buyer by looking to see if there's writs, if there's judgments registered against that property, to see if there's mortgages or other financial encumbrances or financial instruments registered against titles that need to be dealt with.
That's right.
And really what it comes down to is making sure that we understand what's on title, what's on those covenants and encumbrances that have been registered. Does the buyer know what they're buying? Does the seller know what they're selling? Have we got the real property report? Is it clean? And as I said at the outset, thousands of Calgarians every year buy and sell a house. So it's not an unusual legal transaction. They happen as a matter of routine. But every buyer, every seller wants to make sure that that deal is handled properly to protect their own interests. And there's a lot of money at stake. For most of us, buying a house is the biggest investment that we hold. And so we want to make sure that that's done right and that we're comfortable with all the professionals that we deal with right from start to finish in the process.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for sharing all this information with our audience, Brent. Nice to actually have you here. And if you guys have any question for Brent, you can please contact him at 587-329-0399. Or you can give me a call if you have any questions regarding real estate at 403-689-2345. Thanks for watching.